Hello to you all, and thank you for listening to us and seeing us here in another Talk About Wine session. Today, we're going to explain the differences between what is an approval, a declaration, and a proclamation of a vintage. For that, I have my colleague and friend Bento Amaral, who is an expert on port wines. Hello, Bento.
Hi, Paul. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I think what's important for us in this session is that people and even media, most of the time, confuses a lot what is an approval, a declaration, and now a new word that is starting to appear, which is a proclamation of a vintage port. I think first of all we should remember what to expect from a vintage. What is a vintage port and what to expect from it. And after all, we will discuss the different phases of the classification of a vintage. But Bent, what we expect from a vintage port?
Well, before that, you're right, Paulo. There is a lot of misconception regarding approval, declaration, and proclamation of a vintage port. And what is a vintage port? A vintage port is the creme de la creme, even if I love also very old tawnies and very old white ports. But we are talking about exceptional wines in every case. Vintage port is a wine that must be approved. Well, all the port wines must be approved by the Douro Port Wine Institute, and in the particular case of vintage port, it must be approved with a classification of 9 out of 10. So it is called exceptional wines. So a tiny amount of port wine can be produced in this way. These wines are so usually no, for sure, at the second year when they are approved. They are full-bodied, full red, and very well balanced. Sorry?
High tannins.
High tannins, yes. Well balanced, high tannins, high in phenolic compounds, because these wines are going to age for decades in bottle. So phenolic compounds, we are talking about the color and also the tannins, as Paulo said. So these different compounds are going to polymerize, so to aggregate, and then we have a deposit on the in the bottle. And so these are the kind of wine that are going to be approved by the Douro and Port Wine Institute and to age for decades. I don't know if I've answered also to your second question at the same time.
No. Well, you just put a small hint on what we're going to discuss because you said it right, but it's nearly not enough to explain to those who are seeing us and listening to us, because most of the people, and sometimes people, we hear and we read that the IVDP declares the vintage, declares the house vintage, or declares the year as a vintage, but actually IVDP approves the vintage, which is a different thing from declaration. Could you care to explain a little bit about that? What is an approval of a vintage at the laboratories of the IVDP?
Okay, so regarding
so many years there.
Yes. So regarding the approval of the vintage ports, this is something that is carried out by the laboratory of IVDP, as well as of the tasting chamber of IVDP that now Paulo makes part. I've been there for some time, exceptional great time also. But regarding the wines, so they are approved between the January of the second year and June of the second year. So this year, this is being recorded in 2022. This year, during January and June, we had the approval of the wines that have been submitted to be approved for vintage 2020. If someone has a wine that expect to be a vintage from 2019, they wanted to submit now, it's too late. They cannot do it. At the same time, if someone wants to approve at this moment a 2021 vintage port, it's not permitted. They should wait for January 2023.
Another 1 year more. But actually, the institute approves and rejects vintages every year. So actually, every year there is vintage ports in the market, although they are not declared. So the role of the IVDP is to approve or reject the vintage. And then if the vintage is approved, the house can declare it, right? So the idea of a declaration is a responsibility, a task of each house, of each company, state, I would
Yes,
say.
that's it. As you said, the approval is by IVDP, the declaration by their house. And they can have more than a sample approved by IVDP, and they can have the option of only sell one of these wines.
Exactly.
And this happens sometime, okay? And
Yes, and they can
finally,
also, sorry, no, they can also approve one vintage. They can also declare one vintage and do not send to the market other vintage that is not declared as the flagship wine. But there is other sessions on this talk about wines about that, about what's in a single quinta and what's a flagship wine. We'll go through that on another session. And now there is a third word, which is proclamation of a vintage, which is not the proclamation of the vintage, is the proclamation of the year as a vintage year, right? Who does this?
that's it. Paulo, as you know very well, it is the Port Wine Brotherhood that makes the proclamation of a vintage year. Traditionally, it was when 50% of the houses that were associated of the Association of Exporters of Port Wine had vintage ports, they did the proclamation. But in nowadays, with the evolution of enology, the evolution of viticulture, we can have more vintage wines more frequently, and also of more diversity. This means that usually of less volume on the of in years that are not proclaimed as a vintage year. And what happens is nowadays is when there is an agreement between the majority of the big houses of port wine that it has been a great vintage year, and I would say that the port wine brotherhood hears the producers, hears also what are the expectations or the tastings of the more important wine tasters of the world. This is what people have said me in the Port Wine
Yes,
Brotherhood.
exactly. That way, it's more when there is a consensus, when there is
Yes,
a
that's it.
generic
That's the
consensus
word.
that actually the wine is very good, because, as you know, and you explained it a while ago, we are not talking about wines that were made that year. It's wines that are already 2 years old. So the wines are already being tamed, I would say. When all of this is balanced, that the brotherhood actually confirms and makes the proclamation of the year as a vintage in another ritual that exists in the brotherhood. So yes, I would say that we could resume this, that an approval is made by the IVDP, and there are approvals every year. A declaration is made by the house of the company, and it's up to they to put the wine in the market labeled as vintage, as long as it's approved in the IVDP, of course. And if the year is good overall and it's getting very good ratings, and generically, most of the companies that produce vintages have done it on that year, the Brotherhood will proclaim the year as a vintage year or a classic year. So there are three roles, very distinguished and very well defined, between IVDP for approval, companies for declaration, and Brotherhood for proclamation. I would say
You're right,
this would
Paulo.
resume.
You're right.
Yeah, I think this is very
Great.
important. I think this is very important to pass on this message because Port is 250 years old and it's more than 250 years old. And we are still having, it's complex, of course, but sometimes we having in some media and in some seminars people that mess this a little bit and says that the IVDP declares the year, and the confusion is sometimes quite big, I would say. That's it.
Yes, for me that's okay.
Okay. So, Bento, thank you very much, and
Thank you
I
to
hope to
you.
see you soon. Okay. Thank
Yes,
you.
send my regards to everybody from IVDP.
Thank you. You too.